Good afternoon. Can I welcome you all to the final public panel of this day's events that we've had around the theme of Arts of Survival, which is part of the programme of the Tartu 24 European Capital of Culture event. We've had three panels earlier on today for a closed group of invited, and then we decided to have a final open public panel, which we'll come to in just a second. We're very grateful for you coming today. We're very keen to promote understanding of the challenges that the current geopolitical situation gives to people living here and in the region. This is a collaboration of three universities, the University of Tartu, the Baltic Defence College and the University of Cambridge, and we're all part of a Baltic geopolitical network which tries to promote discussion of these issues. This particular event has been financially supported by the British Embassies in Tallinn and in Riga. And the two ambassadors, British ambassadors in those two countries, have hastened to this event from a very powerful, enormous event of world significance, which is the meeting of all British diplomatic representatives around the world, addressed by the new Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. And I'm going to ask Ross Allen, the British ambassador in Tallinn, and Paul Brummel, the British ambassador in Riga, to say a word or two, but really just to thank both of you for supporting this event and making it possible. So would Ross and Paul just like to come up for a quick minute before I introduce the panel more fully?
So first of all, it's fantastic to be here. I'm sorry that I couldn't come earlier in the day for more of the discussions. As Charles said, we get summoned back once a year, all ambassadors from all over the world, to get our marching orders from our ministers. And this year, I think we had the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, Energy Secretary. It was one minister after another. So Paul and I are now very clear about what we have to do over the next few years. I also just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been involved in organising this event. A big thank you to Cambridge University, to Tartu University and to the Baltic Defence College. You've done a brilliant job, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the readouts of the earlier sessions that we couldn't make it to. The topics are incredibly important. I'm looking forward to listening to this session very much as well. I'll maybe say a few more words later on at the reception for those who are able to come later on. Thank you.
Ross, Charles, thank you very much, and it is brilliant to be here. I think we were delighted to support this collaboration between three great academic institutions, and actually the wider work of the Baltic Geopolitics programme is fantastic, just linking together academics and opinions across the region. I think this is a great topic to kind of end the day with around life on the border. I arrived in Riga 3 years ago, and I'm conscious, the border is a hard won thing. The existence of the border came from after centuries of occupation from Germans and Swedes and Poles and Russians. Was prized out in the interwar period and then reprised out in 1991. So actually, when you've got a border, what do you do with it? And I think in the Latvian case, the first instinct was probably around some cautious engagement. They saw themselves as a sort of bridge between East and West. They saw towns like Ventspils as entrepot bringing in oil from Russia and the East. And then, of course, something else happened. You had the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, and that model collapsed almost overnight. And you suddenly had a new model, and we're seeing it day by day. This border is getting harder and harder and harder. And on the Latvian side, there's getting a fence up, and you're getting concrete obstacles behind it, and it is becoming a really tough thing. And everybody now is looking west, but what does that mean? What does that mean for the economies of the regions right on the border? The risks of depopulation. You have a population which is, in many cases, in Latvia, close to the border, predominantly Russian-speaking, with its own challenges around social integration within Latvia itself and how it's regarded. So I think there's a fascinating range of subjects. You've got a great panel of experts, and I'm certainly looking forward to this session. Congratulations to all for putting together this wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross and Paul, very much indeed. As I say, your support's been invaluable. I should just make it clear before introducing the panel that this session is being video recorded, and so it will be up on our websites. It's not a live-streamed event, but it will be up on the websites of the universities in the next few days to see it again, but just to make you aware that that's the case. It's an absolute honour to introduce the moderator of this panel, Professor Emma Widdis from the University of Cambridge, Professor of Slavonic Studies in the Modern Medieval Languages faculty. She's both an outstanding academic leader in her field, but also somebody who's totally committed to getting more understanding of the challenges in this part of the world onto the academic agenda and so the public agendas. Emma, we're really delighted that you've come today. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over now to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. So I am delighted to be here. Charles has just said exactly what I would have said, which is the real pleasure in being here and the significance in being here for us is that it allows us to learn from you and from communities which are living, as it says here in the title, on the border with Russia, more about the particular challenges of this region, and for us to build understanding and knowledge about this region in our institution in Cambridge. So we're very happy that the Centre for Geopolitics is doing that, and it's been an enlightening day. So it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be able to moderate this panel and to learn from our distinguished panelists. Just so you have a sense of what's going to happen today, each of our panelists is going to speak for 10 minutes or maximum or so. They say possibly less than that. And then we'll switch pretty much directly into a conversation with you in the room. We've discussed what we'd like to do with the panel, and we're going to move from an engagement with the particular history of this region in its relation with Russia and the factors that may have shaped the particularity of the region through to a discussion of very contemporary and pressing issues that civil society is dealing with. So I'll introduce each of our speakers in turn as they speak, if that's okay with you. And we'll begin with our first speaker, who is Una Bergman, who's a research fellow in the Academy of Finland in the Alexandria Institute, I believe, and whose recent book, The Politics of Uncertainty, deals specifically with the role of the Baltics in the undoing of the Soviet Union. So Una's going to give us that historical perspective that I think we need to begin our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as a historian, I'm asking myself the question, how did it happen that the Baltic states were able to escape the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, and to escape the Russian zone of influence twice in the 20th century, in the 19, after the 19, the proclamation of independence, and then after 1991, the restoration of independence. And also, how did these Baltic societies survive the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union? And why it has been possible for the Baltic countries, and it has been extremely challenging and often impossible for other nations that have been dominated either by the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. And I will give 4 factors that I think in my perspective can help us to understand these dynamics. And the first one, obviously, is geography. On one hand, it plays in favor and also then against the Baltic countries. As we know from this negative side, the Baltic countries are small, so it's hard for themselves to defend themselves. And the geographical position, as it already was discussed today, is challenging. They are hard to be defended also by the others. At the same time, geography also plays as a huge favor for the Baltic countries. First and foremost, because of their size, they are not seen as crucial as, let's say, Ukraine or Belarus by Russia. But the second reason is the proximity of Europe, or actually being Europe, being part of Europe. As a geographical space, but even more as this political space, as a space that generates ideas, and as a space that creates this possibility of belonging. If we think, let's say, about Lithuania, Lithuania has been a European power as a Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then as a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But Europe also, in Latvian and Estonian case, there was no experience of statehood before the 20th century. But for Latvians and Estonians, as well for Lithuanians, these identities, these national identities, which as everywhere in Europe, this national idea emerged at the same time as we have the national awakenings in Europe. So these two very important ideologies, nationalism and socialism, which emerged in Europe in the 19th century, they do have a huge impact on the Baltic societies. They do have a huge impact also because this is already a fertile soil for them, because these are very educated societies already. If we look at the Russian Empire, then Finland and the Baltic provinces are the part of the Russian Empire with the most literacy. Then, obviously, there is also the Baltic German factor in the case of current-day Estonia and Latvia. I don't want to romanticize the relations between the Baltic Germans and Estonians and Latvians back in the day. These relations were based to a large extent to the exploitation of Latvian and Estonian peasants. But at the same time, it is extremely important that the Baltic Germans are this connection. They are very well connected with the newest ideas of modernization in Europe. They have very good connections in St. Petersburg. And so they are able to lobby for modernization of the Baltic provinces to extent to which doesn't happen at the time yet in the rest of the Russian Empire, or it would happen just later than in the Baltic provinces. And the Baltic Germans are this important third player, which in the Russian, the relations between Latvians and Estonians and the Russian Empire. So there is this third player, which is extremely important, the Baltic Germans. The second thought that I have, why it has been possible, yes, this connection to Europe, but also the connection among the three Baltic countries and this regional solidarity, which we always say we would like to see more of it. There is never enough of the Baltic solidarity, but actually it has played a crucial role in crucial moments of the history of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. As the leader of the Latvian independence movement, Dainis Ivans, once told me that in the late 80s, early 90s, it was very clear that either all three Baltic republics will become independent or none of them will. And we see it very clearly in this, what I would argue is the most important moment in the modern Baltic history, the wars of independence between 1918 and early 20s. This is the time of civil wars in the Baltic countries. It is also the time of wars against foreign intervention, whether German revanchism or the already Soviet Russia playing a role in the region, supporting the local Bolsheviks. And this is a time when, if you look at my country, which is Latvia, then the Latvian government, the government of that Latvia, which exists today, Latvia, the Democratic Republic, which was proclaimed on the 18th of November 1918, this government had to face an enormous challenge. They had to fight against Russian and Latvian Bolsheviks. They had to fight against the Baltic Germans. They had to fight against the army of Bermondt-Avalov, which is, I can't even briefly explain what it was, but some sort of a mixture of German revanchism and white Russian imperial ideas. But so, and at this moment, why was this government, this version of Latvia, able to prevail? And it was first and foremost because of the support of Estonians and also Lithuanians and the Polish army, and then to also some extent the French and British military presence. So at this moment, the Latvia manages, this version of Latvia that exists today manages to prevail of this because of this regional solidarity, but it also then plays a role in the future of Estonia and Lithuania, because what kind of future would Estonia or Lithuania have if there was already a Bolshevik regime in Latvia in 1920, or some sort of Baltic German state. So if we now think about the early 90s, what happens then I think, and that's my third point, this crucial understanding, which is first and foremost intellectual understanding and then a practical engagement follows. This understanding which comes from lessons of history that neutrality is not an option on the Russian borders, and then there is no real sovereignty in the Russian zone of influence. And this is something that is understood in the early 90s. Not immediately, probably. There are other options that are discussed, but it is something that comes from the lessons of 1939 and 1940. And this enables Baltic societies to have this very determined push for European Union membership and NATO membership. And then my final point is that, of course, the agency of the Baltic countries matter, as I explained. It was the desire of Baltic societies to get out of this Russian zone of influence and to escape the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. But what is extremely important in the 90s, it is the idea that has emerged already during the Cold War and even in the Soviet Union, this idea that the Baltic countries are somehow an exception. For the West, during the Cold War, the Baltic states were an exception because in 1940, the United States and then the rest of Western European countries did not recognize the annexation of the Baltic countries by the Soviet Union as legal. So in the eyes of the West, during the Cold War, these three republics are not legally part of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there is a particular perception of the Baltic countries as being the most European, most modernized, somehow not like the rest. And I think this has an impact in the 90s and in the early 2000s, when the West is willing to make the exception, in which is perceived as this post-Soviet space, to say, yes, but the Baltic countries do not really belong there. They do have the right to ask for the NATO and EU membership. And then something that already Donatas mentioned, that also for Russia there is some sort of at least understanding that the Baltic statehood is legitimate, and Putin's willingness to accept. Putin doesn't go to war because Baltic countries become members of NATO. Yes, because probably Putin's regime is quite weak at the time, and it's his early days in the leadership of Russia. But at the same time, I think there is some sort of understanding that what Putin has imagined as this post-Soviet imperial formation, which depends on in which Russia has a huge influence, that it can exist without the Baltic countries, and it's not a huge loss. So yes, those were my 4 points.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Una. So we'll turn now then to Rainer Sachs, who, and this is really as a segue from that wonderful sort of rooted historical context into the pragmatics and practicalities of this current moment. So Rainer is a practitioner in the sense that he's currently the Vice President of CyberX Technologies, but has a 25-year career in government foreign policy in Estonia, most recently as the former Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So Rainer's going to take us into the present, I think, very firmly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and it's always very good, nice to be here in Tartu City, and especially if you are possibility to talk on event organized by your own alma mater. It's it's something special. What I'd like to talk today is a little bit about the Russian military planning in the Baltic Sea region. I'm not talking about the Russian military planning in more like globally or more general, so I will not touch these elements which are not present here in the Baltics. But just to understand a little bit, how do they see the security issues here on the Baltic region, and that usually reflects on military planning very much in the case of the Russian Federation. And if we are not doing military planning against something, then usually we can say that this or that issue is not maybe on a high ranking importance in their assessment. But it doesn't mean that they don't reassess their plans according to the change of the situation. So what I'm talking at the moment is a period that goes, that starts after the collapse of Soviet Union and actually ends with the beginning of a war in Ukraine in 2022, a large-scale invasion, let's say, which was started in 24 February 2022. Because at the moment there is changing taking place, and Russia will start the new military planning about our region. They already have been promoting it in public media, establishing some new institutions here. on our eastern border, but it doesn't mean that they have a certain plans already. It's just informational operations, what we are pushing at the moment, but the real plans would be followed. And we don't know it when it will be, let's say, visible. But traditionally, Russian assessment about the Baltic region is they see here like three main problems we have to solve. And if we put it like on a sequence kind of importance, we can say that the first is securing Kaliningrad, especially from a seaside, the aquatorium of Kaliningrad. And we don't see it like it's like 10-mile zone, but it's like more wider zone, which goes up to the Bornholm Island and up to the Swedish coastline. The second issue is Danish Straits. And I'm talking about as a problem for Russians. Russia see as their security problem. They are doing military planning to solve it. And Danish Straits is important element for them. And the third one is the area which we can place between Estonia and Finland on the mouth of a Finnish Gulf, or where Finnish Gulf starts. And if you put them on a map, you will see that the idea is that to keep the Baltic Sea Fleet operational, which most important headquarters is in Kaliningrad, but the Baltic Sea Fleet is not meant just to operate only on Baltic Sea, but also on the Northern Sea. That's just on the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean. And before 2014, when the military conflict in Ukraine started, they were quite satisfied with the situation in Baltic Sea region. Perhaps not with a situation which is in the area which I named as in the beginning of Finnish Gulf, but basically they had some small elements which they considered not to be planned set in a good way or in a satisfying way, but basically the situation was okay. So in that sense, they see that it's very important to have sustainable air forces here, a sustainable fleet. Baltic Sea Fleet is the smallest and the most weak one among the four fleets Russian Federation does have. They don't have a strategic nuclear weapon and so on, but anyway, it's a very small pond here, and we don't need a massive fleet to fulfill these necessary operations which are needed. And of course, there are different type of ground forces, which I will not go into detail because it's not so important. Because you can plan whatever you like, but finally there are different strategic elements which play much more role. Not the quantity of the troops is not important, but the quality of the troops is more important. So the strategic setup for Russia was very important to keep it in a way that they can control Belarus, just to maintain the possible land corridor with Kaliningrad. Isolating Kaliningrad is the worst nightmare that Russia does have. And there are a lot of elements which we can describe as bilateral relations between Lithuania and Russia and Poland and Russia. But controlling Belarus, you can compensate these problems. And this was something which actually satisfied the Russian leadership as well, the status and political developments in Belarus. And in 2020, we saw that Russia was ready to, let's say, to take the total control over the Belarus if it's needed. So they are pretty much ready to do the same they are doing in the Ukraine on the territory of Belarus in any time, because this is a vital security concern of the Russian Federation, as they interpret it. And the second strategic goal was also something which was important, but they didn't play it out as some kind of a public goal, was to keep Finland and Sweden away from NATO. Just not to deal with that in public, But in the case of Finland, they were a little bit more noisy on that topic. But basically, they tried to keep some kind of a balance, not to irritate, but to present some kind of concern, let's say, but not to irritate too much. And this was something which was going in a way that we didn't expect that they will join in one day in any way. And the Ukrainian war is just such a game changer, which is something which they didn't calculate as a necessary problem which will arise according to our operation in Ukraine. Now, the question remains that is there any balance between military forces? After 2014, we saw that some NATO countries deployed some elements of our military forces to the Baltic states. And this is not a significant portion of the troops. But the idea is not, I think, in a strategic planning that what is a balance here on the ground in the Baltic states or in Baltic Sea region. But it's more like about the strategic balance, because still the NATO deterrence is functional if Russia really believes that attacking any NATO member will cause a large-scale military conflict between NATO and Russia, which will escalate very quickly up to a nuclear conflict. It doesn't have any kind of strategic importance. What is a real setup of forces here on a limited territory? And that's why we always, if we deal with intelligence, we have to assess capabilities. Yes, that's important, but much more important is to assess the will. And what is a will and what is an intention? And this is more complicated, of course, and that can be changed. And here is a point that if Russia knows that there is no sense to plan any military operation here, which would be successful, they can plan capabilities to be ready if there is a chance. But the point is that they are not just planning offensive capabilities, they are planning defensive capabilities as well. In that regard, of course, what they need to control the situation before the military conflict starts. And here comes this hybrid warfare, which means that they know that the weakest point or weakest moment in the Western allies' capabilities is not the capability as such, but the decision-making process. And so we are trying to destruct this process. And that's why they are building up these hybrid different elements, which I will not go too deep at the moment because it's a very, very long topic. But that the hybrid, which we can see as a part of military planning, because it's a part of a military doctrine in Russia, it's also like a part of a military capability and should be assessed in that framework, not separately. And I will just name the last bullet, and then I will stop because it goes too long. The point is that here has been a lot of discussions talking about international law and so on. International law is one of the tools, like in this hybrid warfare, as we can use it. And they see it in this way. And it's just a chance to block the decision-making processes in different capitals or just generate some kind of mess or deception, whatever, however you call it. And that's why we are so good in that, because they examine it in completely different way, not how to use it to balance something or build up something in a positive way, but how to use it in a destructive way. And I think it's very important to remember, and the wake-up call actually to assess it was not in 2014 when the Crimean operation was taking place, but in 2008 when they offended Georgia, which was the first clear like example of where military thinking. Unfortunately, they did one very important conclusion according to this operation. Putin was a prime minister at that time. They decided to switch on a professional army from this conscript-based mass army. And that is something which we can see that why this military planning is so painful, that they are doing reforms in one hand, and we see that Russia doesn't have this kind of a reserved army system yet, and they don't have any intention to build it up. They will remain with professional troops, which means they are not planning a long-lasting or some kind of conflicts which are based on exhausting on the opposite side. They will always go for deployable troops which are capable to launch quick and effective military operations, and to cover it with some kind of a very good political and diplomatic actions. So I will stop here. So if my last statement is that, do we have any date we plan to go for a military escalation in our region? The correct answer is no, they don't have such kind of a date, but they are trying to be ready for that if it's needed and if there is a chance. That's it.
Thank you so much, Rainer. So, having set that out, we now pivot to our next speakers, who are both going to speak about responses in these regions to the perceived threat from their near neighbour. So first of these two speakers, we have Piret Ehin, who is Professor of Comparative Politics and Deputy Head of the Johan Sitter Institute of Political Studies here in the University of Tartu. So, Piret.
Thank you, Emma, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about a specific aspect of societal resilience, namely social cohesion, interethnic relations, and the integration of minorities. And I will be focusing on Estonia. Baltic comparisons certainly would be very interesting, but I'm afraid I won't be able to do that in 10 minutes. I will be referring to studies based on large public opinion surveys conducted by the Government Office of Estonia and the Ministry of Culture. One of them is the integration monitoring, and the other is a series of public opinion monitorings. So based on large nationally representative samples with a sizable Russian-speaking group included. So my main questions are, how are we doing in terms of societal integration, and what has been the effect of Russia's war on Ukraine on interethnic relations here in Estonia? But I will briefly be referring also to party politics and electoral politics and the ethnic dimension of that. Because we have an international audience here, I will start with some basic facts, and then I will try to make 5 points. So just some basic facts. Ethnic composition of Estonia, 70% ethnic Estonian, 25% ethnic Russian, couple of additional percent Russian speaking, and there has been a substantial increase in the Ukrainian population before the full-scale war. Counting also the temporary workers, they constituted about 2% of the population of Estonia. I think now it's at least 4, maybe closer to 5% of the total population of Estonia. Citizenship, as you probably know, Estonia adopted a restitutionist citizenship law back in 1992. Citizenship was automatically granted to the citizens of the First Republic, interwar republic, and their descendants, which initially left 1/3 of the total population of Estonia in the status of this undetermined citizenship, former Soviet citizens, without current statehood. By now, there has been progress in naturalization. 85% of the total population of Estonia has citizenship of Estonia. 10% have citizenship of some other country, mostly Russian Federation, and the share of people in this category of undetermined citizenship is currently about 5%. Language use, 30 plus years after the restoration of Estonian independence, the Russian speakers fall into three main categories, roughly equal. About a third speak Estonian well, about a third have some sort of medium level, and 36%, according to the surveys, speak very little Estonian or none at all. Self-identification, there's a growth in this sort of hybrid identification. The majority of other ethnic residents in Estonia identify as sort of mixed Estonian-Russian, Russian-speaking Estonian, so as opposed to simply and clearly ethnic Russian. And just very briefly, we do have significant ethno-linguistic segmentation in our society, and a feature of the ethnic divide is also socioeconomic equality, not very pronounced, but there is an employment gap and there's an income gap between the two communities. So to my 5 points, and I will try to be brief. The first one, and this is very important, is the diversity of the so-called Russian-speaking population. By no means do the Russian-speaking population constitute some sort of a homogeneous group, and therefore any kind of generalization is risky or perhaps unwarranted. So the Russian speakers in Estonia differ in terms of their level of integration into the Estonian society, their knowledge of the Estonian language. Studies conducted by my colleagues in the social studies department at the University of Tartu show that there are 5 so-called integration clusters. I won't be able to name and describe all of them, but let's say a fifth of the Russian speakers are fully integrated, know the state language, are economically successful. But actually the largest cluster, about 28% of the Russian-speaking population, is still unintegrated, passive, alienated, and sort of antagonistically oriented towards the Estonian state and society. So as I mentioned, members of this group vary in terms of their citizenship status, Estonian, Russian Federation, or undetermined. There's a whole range of political views, from being strongly pro-West, pro-Ukraine, pro-Estonian to being strongly Putinist. And there are various other differences. But one thing we've learned about these differences is that citizenship actually doesn't matter that much in terms of political views and in terms of trust in Estonian public institutions or loyalty towards the Estonian state. What matters much more is the overall level of integration, knowledge of the Estonian language, and media consumption. And there are also intergenerational differences, but they're not as linear as you would perhaps expect, because actually knowledge of Estonian is the best among the group of people who are middle-aged, as opposed to the young age groups. Okay, so second point, the war in Ukraine has revealed a deep ethnic divide in the Estonian society, and in many ways it has brought to the fore the failures of 30 years of societal integration. So perhaps whatever differences were there latently have now become more obvious. And this is especially obvious when we look at attitudes towards the war in Ukraine. So from the government office survey, we have questions about what is your personal attitude towards the military activities of Russia in Ukraine, and 95% of ethnic Estonians condemned these activities. Among Russian speakers, it's about 50%. I think in the most recent survey, 60% condemn, but 14% explicitly say, I support the military activities of the Russian Federation in Ukraine. And there's a very large share of the Russian-speaking group who would say, I don't know, or I refuse to say. Between a quarter and a third of this group takes this position. There are pronounced differences in terms of readiness to admit Ukrainian refugees, to provide humanitarian, economic, and military aid to Ukraine. I think the question where we had the most pronounced difference was, do you support continuation of sanctions on Russia, even if this would bring about a substantial increase in the cost of living here in Estonia? 75% of ethnic Estonians say, yes, let's continue sanctions, and only 25% of Russian speakers agree with that statement. The fact that these different views have, 2 points I need to make. One is, once again, the Russian-speaking population, as was perhaps evident from these figures, is not uniform in its opinions. It's internally deeply polarized. And a second point is that what we see from the surveys is that Estonians, as a result of these, differences of views becoming more sort of openly on display, Estonians have become more pessimistic about societal integration. So there has been a significant drop in the percent of ethnic Estonians who believe integration has been successful. So comparing 2020 and 2023. Third point, just very briefly, obviously the war has brought about a change in the ethnic composition of Estonia, and there's sort of as a result of the influx of Ukrainian refugees. The exact numbers are a bit hard to establish, but there have been more than 150,000 registered entries of Ukrainian citizens since the start of the full-scale war, and on the border about half of them, so perhaps about 80,000 people, have indicated an intention to stay, even though it's difficult to determine how many exactly have stayed in Estonia. But so it has changed the dynamic of interethnic relations in Estonia, and there are interesting questions to be asked about conflict, coexistence, and competition between Ukrainians and Russian speakers. And again, within the Russian-speaking group, we probably need to distinguish between the old-timers and the more recent arrivals from Russia. Okay, but I won't be able to get into the details of this. But let me just very briefly mention competition on the labor market among people who do not speak Estonian. Party politics, electoral politics. I would say there are three ways that I can identify in which the war has had an impact. One is pockets of radicalization, and by this I primarily mean the formation of the pro-Kremlin movement of Vmesте, Koos, in April 22. This movement has been, later on was registered as a political party. Their electoral performance, well, the share of the votes is small, but in the Estonian context still significant, because this is really in a way the first time in a very long time that we have, literally Putinists vying for a seat in the parliament. So Vmesте got 2.5% of the vote in 2003 general elections, 3.1% of the vote in this year's European elections. Another major impact has been internal conflict and splitting within the Centre Party, which for at least 2 decades was the party that got most of the Russian-speaking vote in Estonia, but it wasn't an ethnic party. It was a party that in a way successfully integrated the Russian speakers into mainstream Estonian politics. So with the war, it has become increasingly difficult to cater to both ethnic Estonians and Russian speakers. The Centre Party has been splitting. There's significant bleeding from the Centre Party, an exodus of ethnic Estonians. And I think overall this is not good news for the representation of Russian speakers. This party will continue to be represented in the parliament, but I think their coalition potential has has dropped significantly. Okay, the war has also contributed to the splitting within the Estonian populist radical right, but I will skip the details here. And my fifth point, the war represents a critical juncture in Estonian minority policies, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say in policies that affect ethnic minorities. The most important of these, of course, is the education reform, or the sort of gradual but full-scale transition to a unified school system where Estonian is the language of instruction. This transition will still take about 6 years, and this has been the objective for a long time. But this reform has been delayed and has been slow, and now there's a very clear determination and also a consensus among most significant political actors to really go through with this. I'm probably I should sum up. Yes, a summary assessment. So where do we stand? Yes, there is a deep divide, but I think there's also an openness to societal integration, and there is a certain inclusivity. But it's sort of on a new and different foundation, I would say now. There's a firmer, sort of a newfound refusal, I would say, among the dominant Estonian society to overlook expressions of Russian imperialism or Putinism or support for military aggression. And there's a sort of an insistence that societal integration needs to happen according to a set of norms and values. But I'm optimistic, even though I think it will take time, but I'm optimistic for a number of reasons. I think there's a fairly strong Estonian national identity. There's a certain pride in Estonia's achievements, also in terms of political development, economic development. Estonia is one of these European countries that has not experienced democratic backsliding. There is a strong rule of law. And also, as again, the integration monitoring study clearly shows, the prevalent attitude among ethnic Estonians towards integration of Russian-speaking minorities is rather positive, pragmatic, and inclusive. So this gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that rich and even optimistic talk. So our final speaker is Asta Maskalinaitė, who is the director of the Department of Political and Strategic Studies at the Baltic Defence College. So Asta, thank you.
Thank you very much. I asked to be the last, so with this taking a risk that I will have any time left, because I'm sure that there are people here on the panel who have much more to say on these very interesting topics, which we have been discussing already the entire day. So I will be repeating a lot of them with the idea that repeating them makes them true. And let's hope that that will be the case. Why I asked to speak the last, because while everybody is concentrating on this concrete area of their expertise, I don't feel myself so much of an expert on this, because all the time I look at these titles of the events or conferences, and I kept looking at this Arts of Survival, and it bothered me like really a lot. I know that's a slogan of Tartu 2024, but I looked at it and I'm like, something is, I don't like something here, and what don't I like? I thought, maybe I don't like this word survival. I'm sure that that's the case. What's there not to like about arts, no? And survival is indeed, like, for me, is quite a negative word. Of course, if you or your kids play a lot of these survival computer games, you can see that, yes, you can get some dopamine kick when you achieve something in there, but I'm so clumsy that I cannot achieve anything, and I see that I have no chance of survival in any case. So when I just think about it, I'm like, okay, I will just give up. And that's it. So then I realized that there is a bit better approach here. Ken Booth defined security as a survival plus. So it has a word survival, but it has this plus in it as well, which means trying to achieve some kind of cherished objectives. So what we can talk about is not only about survival, but also about our security, or rather our insecurity, and how we cope with it. So here again, I was, okay, so how we go about it? I have 10 minutes, and how do I discuss dealing with the insecurities in the Baltics, where we had already the whole day, and we can have 5 days more discussing these things. So I went to our newly found best friend, co-pilot in this case, and asked it, so how do you cope with the insecurity? It gave very good political answer to that. I asked it also to distill it into 4 points, and I think those points are quite useful. So the points there were, first, to challenge negative thoughts. Second, to build self-compassion and focus on strengths. Third, seek support. And fourth, set achievable goals and divide tasks into smaller components. So I think these are quite good advices that we can follow. Starting from challenging these negative thoughts. We had a lot of discussions even today about how bad our situation is, how dangerous everything is, and all that. But when we look at it, we also had some talks about that. Baltic countries have never been as safe as we are now. In our 100, a little bit plus years of existence, we are as well placed as we ever were. We are in the EU, we're in NATO, we have all kinds of connections with the outside world. Even our colleague said that even Russia recognizes that we have a right to exist. So I would say not too bad. That's one of these things that we should keep reminding ourselves, especially Lithuanians, as our national sport is not basketball but complaining. So, second point, focus on strengths. Again, we were mentioning throughout the day today quite a few things that we are strong at, and we have a diplomat with us here. We had a diplomat in previous sessions as well, and one of these things is diplomacy is our strength. As we already talked about EU and NATO a lot, we are also we're non-permanent members of Security Council. Lithuania and Estonia held already this seat. Latvia is supposed to hold it in 2026. These are big achievements, and we should be kind of focusing on them as well, because this diplomacy is one of these ways how small countries are punching above their weight. Our second thing, going through this like our military is like the dime perspective, even though they go first later to some other ones. But if we take from this military side as well, we went back to this concept of total defense. And this is also our strength, as we can use here a lot of these strong sides that we have, strong national identities, involvement of society, multiplying our kind of military strength by our civilian population, and so on. So we can see our Kaitselidze, Zemesardze, and Šaulių Sąjunga increasing their membership throughout these years quite significantly, with serious boosts provided by 2014 and later 2022 invasions of Ukraine. So these are the things that we can also exploit very clearly in our, so to say, information narrative as well, showing our big adversary that they will not have walk in the park, no matter what is the international situation, if they decide to do some great operations here. Now, the third point was seek help. Yeah, so I would say that here also we have achieved quite a lot, even within the organizations like the EU and NATO initially, as we started from very slow engagement, particularly on the side of NATO. But now we have quite a few actual elements established here. We have EFPs and FIUs and all kinds of other letter soups, which actually, in addition to this, all acronyms bring in people and bring in connections with the militaries of our allies. Here we also have seen that sometimes it is beneficial for us to be rather impolite, like Lithuanians did with the Germans just recently, as we managed to push through our idea that we need to have this German brigade actually on Lithuanian territory permanently. And this has been kind of agreed and committed and supposed to see full life of daylight, so to say, already in 2026. So the last point is to set achievable goals. Now, our militaries are, of course, good at setting these achievable goals and very good at planning. That is used both for themselves and elsewhere, as we have seen during COVID pandemic. Remember there was such a thing? So we were, just a couple of years ago, we were worried about something completely different. But it's still the civilian part we need to work much more in our countries, including that. I believe that we still have too little debate on how we engage the society in general, beyond all these nice organizations which have a strong part in defense. But what do we do with civilians in general? What do we offer them in this guns versus butter debate? What is their kind of benefit also in participating much more in the defense than they are at the moment? So what we are doing now is publishing all kinds of nice booklets which say, for example, that, well, this is how you should prepare for any crisis. But we basically produce just a lot of paper or a lot of PDFs without actually engaging our societies, because these are full of very funny things which nobody can actually say how exactly they are supposed to work. So with this I will end, that we will need to talk more with, especially in our civil society, and between ourselves, which is I'm very happy that we are doing now. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. So can you join me in thanking our speakers at this stage? So we have a wonderful range, I think, of issues with which you might wish to engage. So let's start by I'll take a set of questions first, and then let the panel respond, and then take a second set of questions. So, James.
Hi, everybody. James Oates from the fundraising team at Cambridge. When I heard Una Bergmane start, I thought I was going to enjoy this session, and I really did. Because when we talk about resilience, the first thing we need to do is go back to the very beginning. And the creation of the political, national, ethno-linguistic community of Latvia, Estonia particularly, actually is rooted in the origins of nationalism. Because Kant and Herder both are Balts, ultimately. And so it wasn't just that the Baltic Germans were adjacent to this new way of thinking about political organization. They were part of it. And I thought that that was absolutely extraordinary to see this history that emerges. So you have in Finland the creation of a Finnish national culture, Kalevala. You have Kalevipoeg, you have Las Places. And actually, it's Estonia, Latvia, and Finland that are the Baltic countries, because a generation later it took before Lithuania has Basanavičius and the creation of. So it's a contemporary of Masaryk, not of Jakobson, not of Kronwalds. So that thinking about the roots of the nation as a political organisation, I thought, is a very powerful message for the resilience of the state. And I thought Piret's comments, particularly in Uusareena's, spoke to that. So if we're talking about the resilience, it's not just about the art of survival, it's about the art of prosperity. And that's rooted in the way in which the states were created and the way in which they've evolved a political culture. And I was just thinking if you wanted to sort of expand on some of those ideas, because, as I say, I always think of Lithuania as a Central European country, but now it's become a Baltic country, and Finland has sort of moved off. But that context, rooted in the different national cultures, I think still matters now, and it speaks about how you engage with the other national communities.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's take some more questions. Let's have...
You've heard from me, Paul Brummel, the British Ambassador to Latvia. What a fantastic panel. That was absolutely great. I think I wanted to go to a point that Dr. Bergmane made, which I thought was really interesting when she said for the Baltic states, neutrality was not an option. And that feels, if you look down the countries on the sort of western side of the former USSR, that feels about right, that all of them sooner or later have concluded that they have to make a very clear and stark choice. But I spent quite a few years in Central Asia, in Turkmenistan and then Kazakhstan. And actually there, the countries of the region probably would say neutrality is an option. I mean, Turkmenistan has physically enshrined neutrality as a UN-endorsed permanent neutrality concept. And I think all the Central Asian republics have tried to sort of maintain an independence from the great power blocs by kind of playing themselves off each other. I just wondered whether the panel had thoughts on why this difference, why the Western part has taken this sort of stark choice where Central Asia has tried to maintain that neutral or independent approach.
So I'm just going to take two more questions, one from the front here and then one from the back, closer to the back, and then I'll try and give everyone a go later.
Hello, my name is Kristiina Našniec. I am a Latvian ambassador in Estonia. And my remark, and probably also a question, is somewhat I would like to continue in the vein of what Dr. Maskalionaite was talking about, namely survival as a raison d'être of a small country. To me, too, it sounds not very inspiring, to say the least. It's depressive and somewhat intellectually limited. So I was thinking actively, if we think art of survival, so survival as raison d'être of a small country on the scale of 1 to 10, so survival is 1, and what could be on the 10? And I would like to propose that maybe it could be the art of imagination, in the sense that in ancient Greece, Athenians prevailed over Persians because they had the wisdom and they had the imagination. They were able to put themselves in the shoes of the Persians and thus predict what they are going to do. So my proposal would be arts of imagination and predicting. And my question: what is the panel thinking about this question? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more. The lady in the third row, I think. Yeah, and then we will.
Thank you so much. I would like to return with my question also to the Baltics and to the point of resilience with 2 points. First, Spiret has mentioned the change in self-identification of the Russian speakers or originally ethnically Russians. As a researcher of identity, I couldn't I couldn't not notice that if in 2015 there would be approximately 2/3 or 3/4 of ethnic Russians who would identify themselves as Russian, even given the opportunity to identify through hybrid Estonian Russian identity or different ethnicities at the same time. In 2022 and ongoing, this number has dropped to approximately 1/4. So people choose to now identify themselves as Estonian Russians, which is a clear sign of the need for the local identity, which is not dictated by the Russia of what it means to be a Russian. So it's not the war that would define them to be Russian, this positive ethnic identity. So is there a chance for us to develop or to provide it for the local Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian Russians? And the second point, I also, again referring a dialogue maybe a bit with Piret, coming back to the data from the government office. And it's remarkable about the numbers, how people think about Ukraine and so on. But having the opportunity of playing around with this data until recently, I used the opportunity to look into what information sources people believe about what is going on in Ukraine defines their positions and understanding. So to understand, 40% of Russian speakers believe Estonian media in Estonian or Russian language about what is going on in Ukraine. About 20 believe Russian Federation media, even though its access it's limited, but still. And when then looking into the positions of these two groups, you see that those who believe Estonian media, their support of NATO membership is around 80%. For record, Estonians, it's 90%. The other group, it's closer to 20%. And it doesn't support of Ukrainian refugees, 90 versus 30%. So their positions is very much defined by the information space they use, they believe. And so what are our opportunities of strengthening this information space now that the Russian Federation media is limited? How to involve those groups who have been using Russian Federation television for decades and using it daily as their background information for dinners or breakfasts. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I suggest that the panelists either respond to all the questions if you wish, or choose one that seems specific to you and try to keep your answers within a minute or so that we can take all the questions. Una, I realise that's optimistic. You say that, I don't mean exactly a minute.
Thank you very much for the question. So the Central Asian and the Baltic Eastern European comparison, I'm not a specialist of Central Asia, so I'm very willing to take any critique from any specialist of Central Asia. I might be wrong, but my understanding is that Central Asian nations and governments have been willing to embrace a neutrality, which then still implies, on certain occasions, some sort of limitations of sovereignty. They would look to Moscow, and Moscow has much more influence in these countries, or at least these things. It is a situation that is changing, but I think that the difference with the Baltic countries and Eastern European countries is that the sovereignty had to be full. If these countries, when they became independent, they very quickly understood that they don't want to accept, they don't want to be this zone of limited sovereignty. Because neutrality at the Russian borders basically means living in a zone of limited sovereignty. It's not an exercise in full sovereignty. Then the question about the survival and the imagination, I think that these two things are and should be combined, because that's something also that if I think how the Baltic countries managed to survive, it is also because they did this exercise of imagination, being able to imagine different and sometimes what seemed fantastic futures. To imagine a future where they would not be a part of some sort of a bigger entity. Well, maybe for Lithuanians it was a bit easier, but for Estonians and Latvians, it was a huge, a grandiose idea, which was very radical, very extreme, and yet it was imagined. And then again, to imagine the collapse of the Soviet Union, an amazing exercise in the capacity to imagine things that seemed impossible.
I'll try to address this neutrality issue as much as I can, and I think in the case of Baltic countries, it's quite easy to understand, because in 1920s and 1930s there was an attempt to play out this neutrality, and it failed. And so this is lessons to be learned. And as much as I remember from the beginning of 90s, the discussions among the politicians, it was absolutely clear cut. We should fully join military defense alliance, which is called NATO. That always came first, and EU just followed by that, after that, sorry. So it doesn't mean it was a total consensus in a society, because there was this kind of a tradition of recommending to be neutral as well. But it was not there was no any serious political group behind who could push it. But it was like intellectual debate. But basically, political agenda in Baltics was very simple in that regard. In Central Asia and almost in Ukraine, I remember in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, it was not any kind of a clear understanding about where the country will belong in the future. In some cases, I will not name the states, because it's maybe I'm not a guy who can point with a finger or stick a finger and think this was happening in this country. But in some cases, you had a feeling that the independence scared them a little bit, because it happened accidentally. It was not a kind of outcome of a normal political process in some places. And people were confused. In such a situation, you're trying to define yourself as a neutral, because you don't have any strategy for a longer future. But here is one element which is quite a characteristic from the countries. According to our historical experience, they see their role in international life as a gateway from east to west. So they know that if there is a stability in the region, you can call it Belt and Road, however you call it, but trade is starting to operate and brings wealthiness and happiness, whatever, prosperity, however you call it. This is how they interpret their history. So we are trying to keep a stability in the region and declaring the neutrality. It looks like it fits for everybody, the partners in the West and the partners in the East. And of course, we are really scared and disturbed about the situation in South, if we're talking especially about Central Asia. So, which means that when neutrality is not a real one, because all these countries are members of this collective defense organization of the CIS countries. And in practice, again, we saw how it functions how it's functioning in practice, in real life. Then maybe you can remember when the Ukrainian troops started this Kursk operation approximately 1 month ago. What was the call of Lukashenko? The call of Lukashenko was that now we, the members of this collective defense organization, should join our capabilities and help Russia to push back the aggressor. There was no any discussion about it. Of course, for Russia, it's politically not a topic as well, because it's quite embarrassing. But the point is that neutrality is a political declaration. There is not any good definition behind. It can be non-allied, non-military allied, whatever. There is countries which have constitutional neutrality declared in constitution, like Moldova, and that's the reason that's a mechanism how we can try to handle the Transnistrian issue. Yeah, so it's very, very tailor-made issues, I would say, but basically I think with in Central Asia especially, and somehow it was in Ukraine was dominating in the 90s, at least in the beginning of the 2000s as well. But we are a neutral country. We try to pick up a benefit from being in the middle of big trade between West and East. This is one of the motivations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I will try to be brief. James' comment about the art of prosperity and the roots of that in how our nations were founded made me think of the famous book by Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Do Nations Fail? And the other side of the coin being then, why do they succeed? And if I may remind you, the key, according to the authors, is inclusive versus extractive institutions. And I think this is an important distinction to keep in mind at the border of Russia. Neutrality, I would just very briefly comment that geopolitical choices are not only about hard security, military alliances, or neutrality, they are also about models of development for transition countries. And I think this we needed clarity in our geopolitical choices and also in terms of models of development here in the Baltics upon restoration of independence. As survival and imagination, I agree with you that survival is a pretty minimal goal. It's at the lower ranks of the Maslow pyramid, right? But as I said in my intro remarks this morning, I think we also need to, we should be aiming to flourish economically, politically, culturally, despite everything. Even though we live in the shadow of the war, we live in the shadow of this hard border, we sort of feel like we're increasingly at the edge of the world. But the question is, how do we not only survive, but also flourish? And I'm sure that takes some imagination. Mariana, thank you very much for your comments. Fully agree with everything you said, and very much agree with you. The issue of information space and media consumption is key. And a month into the full-scale war, there was a EU-wide ban of the Russian propaganda channels. And Estonia, one of the policy changes I wasn't able to mention was boosting support for Russian language media, both public and private, in Estonia, and I think this needs to be continued. And we political scientists need to try to contribute and help these channels produce quality content. And I'm happy to mention that our institute, we launched an initiative a year and a half ago, and we've been able to keep it up. We have our own weekly column in Rus Postimees, the Russian edition of the main daily Postimees. There's a column called Ad Politologa from the political scientist, trying to promote informed discussion of topical political issues. Thank you.
Okay, so well, everybody says everything, so I can just stay quiet, even though, yes, as a Lithuanian, my blood should be boiling if we are put somewhere not the first. So my take on it is that Lithuania was the last to develop German-style nationalism, because we already had political nationalism based on the legacy of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So. Done with that. Just for the Central Asia question, I guess one thing that maybe was not mentioned is the proximity of Europe for the Baltic states, and this proximity of this model of different model of development, which we took as very good example and followed through. That was something that Central Asian countries do not have. And regarding the survival and imagination, yes, I think the main point is that we have to have our countries attractive. Like if we are just about this doom and gloom of everyday survival, then who actually wants to live here? It's like, then go somewhere else and just... That's why we have these levels of emigration and everything. But we have to emphasize that life is good here. At the moment, it is. No matter this shadow that is hanging over us.
Excellent. So we have time for another round of questions, certainly. So, Donatus. And hopefully some from the back also.
I've got a question for Mr. Rainer Sachs. Just during the break, me and my colleagues were discussing all sorts of kinetic scenarios in the Baltic in the context of this war in Ukraine. And you've probably heard about this one, so I was wondering if you could say whether it makes sense to you at all. So the idea, of de-escalation through escalation, right? So let's say things do not go as planned for Russia in Ukraine. They see that they will not be able to achieve what they want there. So they do this thing with little green men from Belarus, some sort of creating, giving Lithuania their own very special little Donbass somewhere, or Latvia, somewhere along the border. Yeah. And then they go to the Americans and say, let's do a deal, you get out of Ukraine and we will leave your colonies unmolested in return. How likely do you think this scenario is? And is it real at all?
Very good. Then there's a question, the gentleman in the third row, and then two more there. So, yeah.
Thank you for the panelists for really high level and good content, great content deliberations. I'm Tapio Reinikainen from Finnish Environment Institute and a negotiator of European Union and Finland in 3 environmental global agreements. And I'm here in a cycling tour and had an opportunity to go to Võru Museum and see Kreutzwald Museum and see rethink again about the national awakening in Viro and in Finland and Kreutzwald and Lönnrot were those who were writing the national eposes of these countries. Followed by then awakening of the culture in general, education, and national institutions and economy in the end of the day that keeps us still running. And as colleague here was referring to the prosperity, I think it's a very important issue that keeps us surviving, but even much more. thriving in the world, and now we are living in the verge of triple planetary crisis, and we need to solve these. And so, what are in your minds, panelists? What is the role of green energy transition in this kind of survival game or game of prosperity and progress of our societies? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to Ross, and then to James.
Thank you, Ross, British Ambassador to Estonia. We're talking about the border with Russia. Currently, Finland's border is closed, but the other 3 borders are open. What are each of your thoughts on that? So should the Finnish one stay closed or reopen? And do you think the Baltic states should have open or closed borders with Russia at the moment?
Thank you. Jimmy, British military. So to Professor Pert, really interesting research, but my question is on the distinction between attitudes and behaviours. And as alarming as the cleavages are that you discussed, is there any evidence that the pro-Putinists are either migrating to Ukraine or to Russia? And to everyone on the panel, what should or could be done in response to temper those opinions?
I think we can take one more question. Oh, I really wanted someone from the back, though. Can I take someone? Yeah. So can you take one of the people with their hand up from the back? Yeah. Who hasn't been at the panel all day?
Thank you.
So,
hasn't been at the panel all day.
Yeah, the guy behind you, sorry. Just because of members of the public are here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the great panel. Seems like the land borders of Baltic states must be populated by the Russian-speaking people. And I'm just wondering, nowadays on the mainstream media and political agenda of Baltic states, are there any, predictions or claims of possible Russian provocation on, ethnic clash on the borders of Baltic states?
Okay, I think we probably should have you answer all of those questions at this point, and then we'll see whether we've got any more time. Let's start, first of all, shall we, with us?
Oh, that's...
Although I know how you love to go last.
Yes, I love to go last, and I can say everybody said everything already. Because these are very complicated questions, on some of which I have politicians' answers. Say about the borders with Russia, I would say it depends. No, it's like actually you can find arguments for and you can find arguments against this closing of borders. So I know that our populations are, especially these vocal parts, are getting very nervous about it, and in that sense, maybe it's better to would be better to have them closed. On the other hand, we know that this doesn't stop, if bad people want to get in, they would get in anyways. If good people want to get in, they would have issues. So, again, it can be one way or it can be the other. We had this very interesting question about green energy transition. I personally think that it would be a great help for everybody if we did that as fast as possible, because we talked in the first panel today how much Russia is dependent on oil and such things. So if we could manage to have most of our energy done by, say, solar or wind or waves, of which only wind is present here in Estonia, then it would be quite great, actually, and we would solve a lot of issues for ourselves. Just how fast it can happen is a different story. With the ethnic clashes, we already had such experience, so yes, it can happen again. But I think we are already prepared for these scenarios. They have been tried before, and we know more or less how they work. So I would be more worried about some newer scenarios than this. and maybe just a little bit about attitudes versus behaviors. In Lithuania, we don't have such a huge, say, Russian minority, but we have problem with some people's attitudes as well, to a large extent. And well, I would say the good thing about it is that majority of them are these sofa warriors. They are unhappy, but they are never going to do anything about it. They are just, yeah, let's go as long as I don't have to move from my sofa. And there is this other minority who may do something, and for which I have great hopes on our security services, that they are observing what is happening and who is doing what. I'm more worried sometimes that focusing, say, on particular groups of people, they would not overlook some other groups of people who may be as nastily inclined. Let's put it that way.
Thank you, Piret. And as I say, you don't have to answer all the questions if you want to focus on.
On the issue of borders, I won't attempt to advise the Finnish government. Let me just say, Estonia has restricted the entry of Russian nationals. It does not let in Russian citizens on short-term Schengen visas, regardless of which country issued the visa or what the country of destination is. And I think this policy is justified, especially in a situation where European countries have banned all flights to and from Russia. It would not be fair to expect that countries with a land border on Russia would then shoulder and manage all that traffic. So in this instance, I would say if this Estonian policy is not in full compliance with Schengen rules, then perhaps it's time for the Schengen rules to be adjusted to the current context of war. On attitudes, I really like the question about attitudes and their behavioral implications. I think that's a question we always need to ask when we talk about public opinion and attitudes. I would say in this case, the implications are perhaps mostly, behavioral implications are mostly electoral. No one is lining up to move to Russia or join the ranks of Putin's army in Ukraine. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, then I will reply to you. And of course, here are two possible ways to reply to this. One is very brief, and the brief reply could be that any scenario is hypothetically possible. You can construct a situation when it works out, and that's why you're asking this is because we have seen it in the practice, but in different places and in different circumstances. And I can draw you this kind of example here is that when it happened in Crimea and was played out in eastern Ukraine as well, some very concerned people arrived in Estonia. I was official in that time, working for Estonian government in foreign intelligence. And they asked the question pretty much what you did. And what you will do if the green men are coming across the Estonian border? And our reply was, we will kill them. What next? Please, the next question. There was no next question. And now I'll give you a little bit longer explanation. Why I was talking so much about how the Russians are doing a military planning? Because the military planning are showing their capabilities and their basic idea and what is a strategy for Russia in Ukraine at the moment, that we are involved in a war we didn't prepare for. That's why they are not successful as well. We don't have a success. And the Gerasimov doctrine says that the idea of Gerasimov doctrine is pretty much to construct, to avoid, let's say, let's put it in way, the Gerasimov's doctrine idea is to avoid Russia's engagement for long-lasting military conflict, and especially with Western countries, because we consider we are not capable to win it in a way they like to. And they simply don't have enough capabilities for that. That's why they're constructing this hybrid warfare, which the deception is a very important point, just to dismantle the Western decision-making process. And so what they do, they offer the opposite side to ignore the situation. And that's how we can move step by step and push forward. And it worked out in Ukraine, and it worked out somehow where even they didn't assess perhaps that the Ukraine is a success story, because we didn't achieve a goal in 2015 as well, because the goal was to take control over the political process in Ukraine, which was not achieved. In 2008, they achieved the goal. They were taking finally the control over the political process in Georgia, or pretty much. Not necessarily in every step, but basically, generally. But what was something which rarely was, according to their standard, absolutely clear Gerasimov doctrine's implementation, was a military operation in Syria. Since from landing and taking this and fulfilling the political goals and so on. Now, if you like to see this green man scenario happening in Baltics, let's say it in Estonia, and you were so polite touching on Lithuania, I will reply talking about Estonia. If you like this kind of operation be executed, they should be confident about the following. The first, that NATO will not react, or the reaction will be very sloppy, very slow, and so on, so on. The second is that they should have enough military capability to back up the possible failure of a green man's operation. So that you can see that it's not just green man is coming in, is not the topic, but the military pressure should be massive. It gives a motivation to NATO to let's say, to pick up this possibility to ignore it and go for a kind of negotiations and compromises and so on. And the third, and that's most important and most decisive, is that we should be absolutely confident that these locals will not resist whom we are attacking. The Estonian government will not resist in a way that the operation will be failed in the beginning, in the first phases. But the first phase is the most critical one. And my interpretation is about the situation like in Ukraine is that what was the Ukrainian problem? We had a constitutional crisis when then Yanukovych left the country. And if you are a presidential system, your security forces are not operational if a president has gone. And there is no any legal substitute on this position. And you can imagine what could happen if Ukrainians were capable or would capable to resist in Crimea already. It could change the whole situation quite dramatically. But Crimea is not a good example as well, because Russia already had a huge naval base and military presence in Crimea, which we don't have in the Baltics, for instance, at the moment, and so on and so on. So the scenario is possible as I described it. Still, we are not fitting these elements. It's not the topic.
Thank you. So, Una, to the very last words of the panel,
I can
I'm
happily
afraid.
say that everything was already answered. No, but I mean, just very quickly, these questions were really very well answered, but I wanted to add something to what Ambassador asked about the Central Asia. Something I think I had to say, and I didn't say, but it's important to say that also this narrative of the happy Central Asian neutrality, it is something that the political elites of these often authoritarian regimes present. But if you talk to the younger generations, especially to the people whom I talk, who are academics, researchers of this younger generation from Central Asia, they wouldn't talk about neutrality. They would talk about this post-colonial Russian dominance in Central Asia. And I think then if things change in these countries internally, and when the younger generations approach the power, I think these relations with Russia will also change.
I will very briefly reply on this board issue as well, because I'm feeling something I have to say.
And then we will stop. Or I'll get you into trouble.
Yeah, but it's just 1 minute. Yeah. And I can reply in a question with giving example from 2015, and it's pretty much there. Then Russia organized the first hybrid attack on a border of Finland and Norway. And these two countries solved the issue in different way. And this is the answer, pretty much, and why it happens again. So I will not go into details anymore, but finally, we need that at least some of the western border is kept open, just for some kind of, not even this kind of limited traffic. They can't tolerate the situation that all the borders are closed. That's why we are, I would say, amazingly correct acting on the border issues with Estonia and with Lithuania as well, I think.
So, thank you. I'm sure you would all like to join me in thanking both our panelists and the organisers for a story of historical legacy, of regional affinities and solidarity, of resilience, and also of imagination, which seems to me a very good way to end these events. And thank you all hugely. Thank you.